Hello, violists. My name is Caroline Castleton. I'm delighted to be with you today. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and I am a doctoral student at the University of Maryland studying with Katherine Murdock. My dissertation is on Rebecca Clarke's performance career. And her compositions are a treasured addition to the viola repertoire. Many of us know them and love them. Her works have been the focus of many papers, presentations, recitals, and recordings. Her success as a composer during the period between the two world wars was something of an anomaly in a world where women received little encouragement towards entering the field. Clarke's achievements as a soloist and chamber musician, however, remarkable at a time when the viola was still emerging as a solo instrument, have curiously been neglected. My dissertation examines Clarke's contribution to viola playing, not only through her compositions for the instrument, but also through her performance practice, repertoire choices, and connection with a broad audience. I want to first acknowledge my advisor, viola teacher, and mentor, Katherine Murdock, who first suggested I look into researching Rebecca Clarke when I came to her with several ideas for dissertation topics, none of which I was as passionate about as Rebecca Clarke. I first heard work by Rebecca Clarke when I went to a recital by Helen Callis, who played Rebecca Clarke's Morpheus, and I fell in love with her music and with the viola. And that was very instrumental at the age of 17 when I decided to switch to viola from the violin. So my teacher, Kathy, has been an invaluable resource as she has given me suggestions, read my very rough drafts, and discussed my direction in this work. My research has included numerous primary sources, none of which I would have had access to if it weren't for Christopher Johnson, Rebecca Clarke's great nephew by marriage, who has generously granted me access to her performance materials, including the scores and parts of music she performed, her memoir, entries from Clarke's diaries, and photographs. He's also been a great source of clarification on questions I've had about the items he sent. And I would not have been able to do this project without his generosity of time and resources. And please, if you haven't yet, check out his website dedicated to Rebecca Clarke, RebeccaClarkeComposer.com. Today's focus will be on Clarke's education and her career highlights through 1939. And I'm particularly excited to share about her BBC broadcast performances. Post 1939, she came to the US and did do some performing and quite a bit of composing before she married her former classmate, James Friskin. But I won't be speaking to that period of her life today because there isn't enough time. Another large section of my dissertation focuses on Clarke's fingerings and other markings in some of her sheet music, and what we can glean about her particular playing style from those examinations. But again, we'll save that analysis for another time. Rebecca Clarke was born in 1886 in Harrow, England, near London, to an American father and a German mother. Her father, Joseph Clarke, was very domineering, and his behavior would likely be viewed as abusive in today's world. But his enthusiasm for music was probably the impetus for his daughter's attraction to the art form. He provided for his children to have lessons and required them all to play hours of chamber music at home, even compelling his busy and overworked wife to learn the viola in order to facilitate string quartet playing. This quote is from Clarke's unpublished memoir entitled "I Had a Father Too." She said, "Papa frowned on the idea of a musical career. What he wanted," he said, turning conventional, "was for me to make some good man happy, to which the inevitable rejoinder was that I would rather make some bad man unhappy. Anyway," he went on, "why should I want to earn money when I didn't have to? Much better stay at home and be a good daughter to mama." We know relatively little of Clarke's training as a young girl, but her memoir provides some details, especially her growing passion for music and her high regard for masterful performance, even at a very young age. Clarke describes her devoted concert attendance as a young woman, despite her father's disapproval of women pursuing a musical career. She tells this story about seeing Joachim perform. But I was seized with music and persisted. I went to concerts galore, constantly traveling up to London for them. In former days, I had heard all the famous violinists, Sarasate, Kubelik, and my idol, Isaïe. St. James's Hall, now the site of the Piccadilly Hotel, was still standing, and there I had also listened to the Joachim Quartet. Now, on what must have been one of its last appearances in England, the quartet came to Queen's Hall, and with my heart in my mouth, I heard the deaf and aging Joachim lose his place in the Brahms clarinet quintet, evidently because of some mix-up about whether to make the repeat in the first movement. He was out for several bars before he realized it, and it was pathetic to see his complete unconsciousness of the efforts the others were making to get together with him. So the reason this is striking to me is that each of the violinists she mentions here were tellingly also composers, which suggests that in her mind, performer and composer weren't separated the way we see them today. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were the height of the great virtuoso performers like Paganini, who wrote their own music because what was there was insufficient to showcase their technical prowess. So Clarke was born in the middle of that, and we can see how the two branches of the art form were connected for her. And her career ambitions were likely included a desire for developing as a whole musician, performer, and composer as one. So to me, it doesn't really make sense that the published literature tends to focus on her solely as a composer, while mentioning in passing that she also happened to be a violist. Clarke writes that her father sent her to violin lessons at the age of 8 under the tutelage of Mr. Cave, a teacher in the neighborhood. Actually, the lessons were really supposed to be for Hans. Hans was her younger brother. I was only a girl, but I was allowed to go with him and pick up anything I could. Mr. Cave began by making us play with books under our right arm. The elbow must not be raised, the wrist must be curved and swan-like. In later life, when I took up playing seriously, I had endless trouble trying to counteract this. How we hated it all. Pablo Casals also spoke out about this common teaching practice from the early 20th century. He said, "We were obliged to play with a stiff arm and keep a book under the armpit. What rhyme or reason is there to such an idea? I have always advocated complete freedom in the movement of the right arm, including the elbow. This free action makes the whole bow technique stronger and easier." And here is a lovely picture of Casals, who is clearly not holding a book under his arm. And you can see his free bow arm. At the age of 16, Clarke's father enrolled her at the Royal Academy of Music, where she studied alongside classmates who would become quite famous, and some who were already famous. She wrote, "The bustle of all the students going from class to class, the sounds of the different lessons and rehearsals mingling together were very exciting. Awestruck, I gazed at the composition students whose names were already known to me. There they were in person at the fortnightly concerts. Benjamin Dale, York Bowen, and grandest of all, Arnold Bax, resplendent in a pale greenish suit with a pink carnation in his buttonhole. Pigtailed nonentity that I was, I never crossed my mind that later on in my professional life, I should become acquainted with these gods." There's Benjamin Dale, York Bowen, and Arnold Bax, beloved by violists today. She also met Myra Hess at the Royal Academy. She wrote, "In addition, there were orchestra practices in various classes, including one in French, where I soon made friends with a pretty, wavy-haired little girl who had an engaging habit of hunching up her shoulders when she played, or when she giggled, which was frequently. She was 1 or 2 years younger than I was, and her name was Myra Hess." Myra Hess was the subject of Clarke's 1976 interview with Robert Sherman on WQXR, where he learned that Clarke was a composer. This is a pretty famous interview, and many give credit to that interview for sparking interest in Clarke's music, although there was interest in her music prior to that interview. At the Royal Academy, Clarke studied with Hans Vesely. She left us a few comments about his teaching, very few of which were positive. She wrote, "London enchanted me and I found the RAM thrilling, even if Hans Vesely was a stern and sometimes unkind teacher." Then in an interview with Nancy Usher, she said that he was very good for the left hand, but wasn't so good for bowing. And I will tell you why I needed someone for bowing. And she goes on to discuss the book under the arm technique. She said, "I mean, everybody can learn how to finger, but the bow is really, anyway, it took me a long time to have a reasonably good bow arm, and Vesely wasn't too good for that. He was also a very rather unkind teacher. Nobody liked him very much." Tertis also studied with Hans Vesely and had some criticisms himself. He said he was dictatorial, inclined to be conceited, and as a teacher, rather harsh. He taught well up to a point, only up to a point, however. For the most important tricks of the trade, he jealously kept to himself. Vesely published a treatise, the bulk of which is devoted to left-hand technique, which tracks with Clarke's description of his focus as a teacher. The section on bowing is reduced to descriptions of bow strokes with very little instruction on tone production, arm weight, or phrasing, which, on the other hand, it is rather difficult to put those concepts in print, as many of us know. So despite his flaws as a teacher, however, Vesely's attitude about women's aptitude for playing must have presented a striking contrast to her father's. The treatise was published in 1913, the same year that the Queen's Hall Orchestra, led by Sir Henry Wood, became the first professional orchestra to admit women, hiring 6 of them, one of whom was Rebecca Clarke. And he wrote on the second page of his treatise, "The violin," Vesely that is, "the violin loses none of its charms in ladies' hands. As a rule, lady violinists are very thorough and are as easily instructed as men, for they seem to fall in with the methods of their teachers in a very marked manner." Close to Clarke's 3rd year at the Royal Academy, she was proposed to by her harmony teacher, Percy Miles, which led to her father abruptly removing her from the school. Clarke spent some time in America with relatives and experimented with songwriting at home. Joseph Clarke sent some of Rebecca's songs to Charles Villiers Stanford at the Royal College of Music, who invited her to enroll and study with him, which her father permitted her to do in 1908. This picture was taken circa 1908, and you can see that very low elbow. To me, it looks like she's playing on the A string in this picture, and it looks like about an E string level elbow to me. This is a violin, of course. And you can see her long arms and her tall stature. She was nearly 6 feet tall. As a violist, I look at those long arms and think she was born to play the viola. It was Stanford's prompting that led Clarke to switch. Some of us might be familiar with the upper part of this quote from Clarke's memoir. It's been quoted in a few articles about her, but the lower portion may not be as well known. "You must come into the orchestra," Sir Charles had said soon after I entered the college. He was the conductor. "Change over to the viola," he continued, "because then you are right in the middle of the sound and can tell how it's all done." And from that moment, the viola became my instrument. I had felt an affinity for it ever since I was a child and first heard the 2 Brahms songs with viola obbligato. So the switch from violin felt very natural. I have always been glad I made it. And according to the records I've gathered, she indeed performed the Brahms songs quite often in her professional life. Clarke didn't give us any details about studying with Tertis, though she does confirm that she did in her 1978 interview with Nancy Usher. It's hard to say when exactly this was, but one guess might be when she was invited to switch to viola by Stanford in 1908. Tertis was teaching at the Royal Academy, though, so she wouldn't have had access to him at the Royal College, though it's possible she could have asked him for private lessons. Tertis left teaching for a time in December 1909 to lead the viola section in an orchestra newly founded by Sir Thomas Beecham. She certainly may have solicited lessons from Tertis anytime between 1908 and the early 1910s. He was only 10 years her senior and still in the beginning stages of his own career, though. That decade, the 1910s, was very formative for him as well as for Rebecca Clarke. Since Clarke didn't write much about what she learned from Tertis, we can study other accounts of what he was like as a teacher. I'm including the composer Eric Coates's account here because he was the most likely to have overlapped with Clarke as he studied with Tertis from 1906 to 1909. This quote is in John White's comprehensive biography of Lionel Tertis. My master then seated himself at the piano and I stumbled through some Tartini. I don't mind admitting that he played the piano a great deal better than I played the viola. Not at all bad. An excellent bow arm, but not a very good left hand. I should have to work hard at tone production first, though, and then technique later on. Could I put up with practicing nothing but slow bowings for the next month or so? Sometimes 3 or 4 hours a day? I should have plenty of playing otherwise in the weekly orchestral practices. Of course I could. To please the master, I would do anything. And he writes here, after he stuck to it for all those weeks, the difference in my tone was remarkable. We also know from Lionel Tertis's pamphlet, Beauty of Tone and String Playing, that he was very concerned with the bow arm, as we violists know is right and proper. William Primrose said that violinists can get away with bad bow technique, but not violists, right? It's a pretty sure bet that Tertis probably held a similar priority towards the bow arm and tone production in Clarke's lessons. So this is likely where she was able to make some good progress correcting that swan-like low elbow. There is evidence that Clarke resented Tertis later in life because Tertis left her name out of his written works that included repertoire lists for viola, which truly was a travesty. And there were other women whose works for viola and piano he was well aware of, having played through them and praised them, including Minna Keel and Elizabeth McConchie, whose names were also left out. So I might have a hard time forgiving Tertis for that myself. But certainly as Clarke's career developed alongside Tertis before his books were published in the second half of the 20th century, she seems to have held a deep respect for him. She wrote, in England, the viola's present position has been greatly influenced by a very fine player, Lionel Tertis, whose mastery of this awkward and difficult instrument is without parallel, and whose enthusiasm has inspired many composers to write works ranging from viola solos to a sextet for 6 violas by Benjamin Dale. And this is from her article on the viola from Cobbett's Cyclopedic Survey of Chamber Music. And she indeed performed the Benjamin Dale with Lionel Tertis in a group of 6 violists. A great piece if you ever get a chance to play it. So once she was done with her education, she was actually due to a dispute with her father, cut off financially. So she had to get working right away and put herself out there. In 1910, she joined the Nora Clench Quartet. Here on the left is Nora Clench. She was a violinist who had studied with Joachim and was quite well known, toured around Europe with her quartet. May Mookley, on the right here, was the cellist in the quartet, and this could have been Clarke's first real solid professional association with her, though it's very likely that they knew each other before. May Mookley and Rebecca Clarke had a long association through both of their careers, and Mookley was a source of inspiration and advice for Clarke's Rhapsody for cello and piano and for her piano trio. As I mentioned before, Clarke was one of 6 women to be invited to join the Queen's Hall Orchestra in 1913, led by Sir Henry Wood. And she was let in based on an audition in which she sight read Don Juan, if you can believe it. All of us who have slaved away practicing Don Juan, preparing for auditions, know how amazing that sounds. Maria Foltz Baylock wrote a master's thesis about the English Ensemble, Clarke's piano quartet from later years. And she discusses quite a bit why England was such fertile ground for professional women musicians. And it makes sense that this great development in orchestral history would happen in England. So between 1916 and 1924, Clarke and Mookley traveled together quite a bit. In 1916, they went to the US, where in 1917, they met Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. The following year, Mookley and Clarke had their New York debut in the Aeolian Concert Hall. And this is the famous program where Clarke used Anthony Trent as a pseudonym for her piece Morpheus. So many of you may have seen that program. In 1918, she went to her first Berkshire Festival, sponsored by Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge. The festival, that is, was sponsored by Coolidge. In 1919, she went to Hawaii, then came back to the US to work on her viola sonata. And in September was the famous 1919 viola competition, where she tied for first place with Ernest Bloch, and where Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge was the tiebreaker among the jury members, and Clarke ended up getting second place. In 1920, Clarke's father died. In 1921, she went to the Berkshire Festival again, submitting her piano trio for that year's competition, and it won second place. In 1922, she took a tour with Mookley of the British colonies in Asia, including Burma at the time, now Myanmar, India, Singapore, Japan, China, and Indonesia. In 1923, she went to Hawaii again with Mookley to work on her cello Rhapsody, this time commissioned by Coolidge for that year's festival. And then in 1924, she came back to London and made it her home base. April 8th, 1925 was Clarke's first radio broadcast. She wrote in her diary, "The most heavenly sunny day, had high tea and then fetched Gordon and the others and went to Savoy Hill for our broadcasting. First time I had done it. Felt rather nervous, but it didn't go badly. Very interesting to see the shrouded room and the microphone. Quite thrilling." The program featured the soprano Dorothy Silk, as you can see, as well as Clarke's ensemble, the Aeolian Players, which included flutist Joseph Slater, violinist Constance Izzard, and pianist Gordon Bryan. The format consisted of works for singer and piano alternating with instrumental chamber works of various sizes of combinations. And this was a model for most of the nearly 70 broadcasts in which Rebecca Clarke would participate over the next 15 years. Most of them with the Aeolian Players, later the New Aeolian Players, and her all-women group, the English Ensemble. Clarke was featured as a soloist in some capacity in the majority of her broadcasts with the Aeolian Players. And between 1926 and 1928, she also headlined programs in which she was a sole instrumental soloist, playing full programs of repertoire for which the pianist wasn't named. And we'll get to those in a little bit more detail later. Just a little tidbit about this first work that she played on this program. The first piece she ever performed on the radio was the Sussex Mummers Christmas Carol by Percy Grainger. The two knew each other, and in a March 25th article in the School Music Review announcing this broadcast, BBC programming staff member K.A. Wright announced the formation of the Aeolian Players and their first broadcast, adding, "It is interesting to note that Percy Grainger made a special arrangement of his Sussex Mummers Christmas Carol for Miss Clarke, who will play it on this occasion." So there's some evidence that they worked together on this. When you look at the music that she had, the sheet music which she had in her collection, it is a written out part that is mostly a transcription of Grainger's original work, which is for violin or cello. And but she adds some notes to fill out some of the chords. She adds a few double stops in places. And it seems pretty clear that she and Grainger worked this out. And so it's pretty fascinating to see that, the respect that these two great musicians had for one another and how they worked together for her debut as on the radio. While BBC Radio did not feature Rebecca Clarke as a soloist nearly as often as her more famous male contemporaries, Lionel Tertis and William Primrose, her wireless appearances were really no small matter. Clarke's involvement with the BBC was a testament to her talent and resourcefulness during a time of extraordinary upheaval for British musicians. Jennifer Doctor, in her book, The BBC and Ultramodern Music, discusses reasons why this was such a challenging time for musicians. The downfall of the silent film industry, the stock market crash of 1929, and the influx of musicians fleeing Nazi Germany all contributed to literally thousands of job losses in Britain for musicians. Doctor writes, during this turbulent period, the BBC was born and rapidly gained power, resources, and credibility. And perhaps most significantly in this time of social and economic fluctuation, the BBC had money to spend. Within a decade of its formation, the BBC not only became the most significant music disseminator in Britain, it was the foremost employer of British musicians. And Rebecca Clarke's place among these musicians was a significant boost to her career. Unlike commercial radio stations in the United States, the BBC did not have to compete with other entities for listeners' attention. In 1922, the government granted it sole right to broadcast in the United Kingdom. So the BBC was the public's only source of radio broadcasts, transmitting programming from its channel 2LO, and then every once in a while a simultaneous broadcast. They would do two broadcasts, and the alternate channel was 5XX. And this meant that Rebecca Clarke's performances were reaching millions of listeners by the 1930s with virtually no competition from other broadcasting sources. If you listened to the radio and she was playing, that was what you listened to. Her name would have been widely recognized by the listening public. And just thinking about that, comparing it to YouTube hits today, we don't even come close. The only violist that I can find on YouTube who has over 1 million hits is David Aaron Carpenter, and on 2 of his videos. And in one of them, he's actually playing the violin. So these are kind of, it speaks to the time, of course, because of the nature of radio in Britain at that time. But I also want to point out that she's not only showing her chops as a musician in these performances and making her name known, but she was also exposing the public to the viola, the same work that Lionel Tertis was doing. So let's talk a little bit about her chamber groups. The Aeolian Players was a little bit of an unconventional chamber group, as you've seen. We had Constance Izzard on violin, Rebecca Clarke, Joseph Slater on flute, and Gordon Bryan on the piano. And Gordon Bryan is here on the right in this cartoon. He was the founder of the group. And all 3 of Rebecca Clarke's colleagues here had made appearances on the radio before, so they were all a little bit more experienced than she was at broadcasting when she first started, but she quickly caught up. Later in 1927, Antonio Brosa replaced Constance Izzard on violin, and we'll learn a little bit more about him later. In 1930, they disbanded for a little while, probably because Gordon Bryan loved international touring, and so he started traveling a lot more as a soloist. And Antonio Brosa also had his own quartet, the Brosa Quartet, which left to perform in the United States around that time. But then in 1934, the group got together again, this time with Jean Pougnier on violin, another very well-known violinist, Rebecca Clarke, Joseph Slater again, and then Angus Morrison on piano. Incidentally, Angus Morrison's biggest public exposure was in the movie Gaslight in 1944, which has gained some attention these days as the phrase gaslighting is taken directly from that movie. The Aeolian Players were very committed to new works. They played works by living composers in most of their presentations. And they were particularly committed to British composers. So these are the names of, these are the names of all the British composers that they performed in their programs, including, as you can see, 4 women: Rebecca Clarke, Catherine Egger, Phyllis James, and Ethel Smythe. Less known are Catherine Egger and Phyllis James, but they belonged to the Society of Women Musicians, and they were all very supportive of each other. Clarke's other group, the English Ensemble, was an all-women piano quartet established around 1926 is when they started getting together, whose other members were violinist Marjorie Hayward, cellist May Mookley, and pianist Kathleen Long. Murray Foltz Baylock, who I mentioned before, provides a valuable resource on the history of the ensemble in her 1998 thesis, Women Musicians in Early 20th Century London, the String Players in the English Ensemble. Her account contains some inaccuracies, however, likely due to the difficulties in accessing and searching historical newspapers in the 1990s. It's much easier to do today. The most obvious error is Baylock's assumption that Marjorie Hayward was the only string player in the English ensemble to have participated in the broadcasting and recording industry. Wireless broadcasts were, to the contrary, one of the English ensemble's most important vehicles of performance through the 1920s and the 1930s. So here's May Mukley again. Very wonderful cellist. I highly recommend looking her up and researching her. This is Marjorie Hayward. This photograph is dated around 1926, which of course was right around the time that the English ensemble was formed. Marjorie Hayward was a protege of Ottokar Ševčík, and subsequently made regular appearances with orchestras and in recitals throughout the British Isles. She was a very well-known violinist. She enjoyed an exceptional career, soloing with major orchestras. And in the 1920s, she started turning towards chamber music. She was closer in age to Clarke, but she knew May Mukley when they were both students at the Royal Academy. So in 1897, in the Musical Times reported on a recital given by Royal Academy students in which they were both listed as soloists. The future English ensemble's 3 string players performed together as early as 1911 in a performance of Vaughan Williams' string quartet in G minor at Steinway Hall. And Marjorie Hayward also performed Rebecca Clarke's piano trio with May Mukley and Myra Hess in 1922. The pianist Kathleen Long seems to have been the organizing force behind establishing the English ensemble. Grove Music Online and Long's obituary in the Times credit her with founding the group, the latter recounting that her delight in chamber music led her to form the English quartet. They got the name a little wrong, the English Ensemble, with which she worked for several years. And after its members ceased to play together, she took every opportunity of joining in ensemble works. And as you can see here, in this photograph of an LP, Kathleen Long was quite the recording artist. And Clarke's only commercially released recording was with Kathleen Long, a recording of Mozart's Kegelstadt Trio with Frederick Thurston on clarinet. This is an example of a radio broadcast in which all of the string players of the future English ensemble are taking part, as well as Gordon Bryan of the Aeolian players, with the addition of the tenor John Goss. And here we see, this is a program fully of Rebecca Clarke's music, broadcast on October 29th, 1929. The 4 members of the English ensemble gave their first wireless broadcast performance together on June 11th, 1926. In this clipping on the left, you can see that they played Ernest Bloch's piano quintet with the addition of Stella Pattenden on the second violin part. Clarke first mentions the name English Ensemble in her diary in January 1927. And that same month, an ad for an upcoming concert by the English Ensemble appeared in the London Observer. On the right here is another example, early example of the name in print. This is from the Musical Times in April 1927. There are several rave reviews about the English Ensemble's performances. The newspaper reviewers really seem to like them. You can see on the left, brilliant playing at Guildhall. And then I really like what this review says. Their ensemble is an ensemble of understanding, not merely of time and notes, and the whole effect of their playing is musical. The English Ensemble's radio performances were actually far more conservative than the Aeolian players, drawing from composers of the Viennese school that we all know, like Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, Schumann, Schubert, Mendelssohn, as well as French romantics such as Fauré and Chausson. Their programs were also rarely in the mix and match format of the Aeolian players. They almost exclusively stuck to piano quartets most of the time. But every once in a while, they would perform a string trio or a piano trio, as you can see in this program. On the left bottom, you can see that the string players played two fantasias by Purcell, and also below that, the Bridge Fantasy for Piano Quartet. So this kind of is a good example of when the English Ensemble did break away occasionally from the more traditional piano quartet repertoire from classical and romantic periods. They almost exclusively chose English composers, living up to their name, the English Ensemble. So they performed works by Bax, Bridge, Mackenzie, and most frequently Walton. They played the Walton Piano Quartet quite a bit. When they performed Baroque works, it was also exclusively British composers, as you see the Purcell here as well. There were some works by William Boyce and John Humphreys that they pulled out frequently to perform. And this program also shows the English obsession with the fantasy. Many of composers of this era wrote fantasies or fantasias in their search for distinctly British genres and sounds. This list is a list of repertoire taken from the English Ensemble's brochure that can be found in the Library of Congress in the Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge collection. So I've highlighted all the composers that were still alive in 1926 when the English Ensemble was first starting to form. And you can see that the majority of them are British here from their brochure. I have the British composers in green and the others in yellow. William Hurlstone, I put in dark green. He actually died in 1906, but since he was born the same year as Tertis, we can consider him in the same generation as some of these other composers that were still alive in 1926. Next, we will take a look at Clarke, the soloist. So there's some evidence from interviews that she really thought of herself as a chamber musician more than a soloist, but the evidence contradicts this somewhat. She didn't play concertos with orchestras in the same way that Tertis and Primrose and Hindemith did, but her radio broadcasts and stage appearances certainly spotlighted her as an individual, even when playing works for viola and piano. This drawing, we don't know who it's by. You see in the lower right there, it says 3 quotations from Milton, and this is referring to the composer Phyllis Tate's 3 quotations for viola and piano, which is now sadly lost. Phyllis Tate was unsatisfied with her earlier works and in Brahmsian style destroyed them. Though she did write a work for viola and piano called A Seasonal Sequence, which if you're interested in her works, you can still play. It's available. Clarke was very supportive of her fellow women composers. We know from the Musical Times that she performed this work on June 20th, 1934 in a concert of new works sponsored by the Oxford University Press. And this drawing is dated February 24th, 1935. And it's kind of hurried sketching, and the title suggests to me that it was a sketch of her as she was performing, done in the audience. And that tells us that she likely performed it on that day in 1935. So she performed it at least twice. So we know that she liked it enough to perform it more than once. One of Clarke's greatest triumphs was performing Mozart's Sinfonia Concertante at the BBC Proms with Antonio Brosa, who was at the time in the Aeolian Players group with her. He was a Spanish violinist, quite well known, already an experienced broadcast soloist, and Clarke and Brosa and his wife maintained a friendship, and she even visited them frequently after she relocated to America during World War II. And the reviews were just very praiseworthy. The Times wrote, but the real surprise of the evening was Mozart's Sinfonia Concertante for violin and viola, which was played by Mr. Antonio Brosa and Miss Rebecca Clarke. We felt that we had been raised to an altogether higher plane of thought before 10 bars of it had been played, and the slow movement took us into a world of subtlety and sensibility undreamt of by Haydn. And then we have from the Illustrated London News, a word must be said for what was perhaps the finest piece of concerted playing of the season, namely Miss Rebecca Clarke and Mr. Antonio Brosa's performance of the beautiful Symphony Concertante for violin, viola, and orchestra by Mozart. This was one of the most enjoyable items in the whole 6 weeks program. And there you can see the two, Rebecca Clarke and Antonio Brosa. This program, we see the front and the back here. It's from October 21st, 1925. Clarke was quite the recitalist. She played a lot of the great viola repertoire in recitals and for private performances. So, for example, she played the Bach Sonata for Arnold Bax during a social gathering in his longtime girlfriend Harriet Cohen's apartment. She was a British pianist. In this program that we see on the slide here, she played her viola sonata in a program of Clarke's own works. So again, we can see that she didn't shy away from self-promotion. She was fully active in performing her own pieces. Clarke played these works over BBC Wireless programs that were presented by her ensemble. So as I mentioned, during the Aeolian Players programs, they would each often play something that was a solo. So here we have a list of wonderful works that she performed with them. And on one occasion, she played the Walter Lee Sonatina for viola and piano with the English Ensemble. As I mentioned before, Clarke presented 4 broadcasts in which she was named as viola soloist, and for which the pianist was unnamed. And of course, we always need to credit our pianists, right? They deserve all of the credit they can get. But the omission here really does show us that Rebecca Clarke was the focus and the star of these particular shows. So here she is playing the Grazioli Sonata, which we don't know very well today, although it's still available. Some Wagner and a couple of other arrangements. So in the other 3 performances, she shared the program with some other performers. Here you see a couple of other soloists. And Vladimov's Balalaika Orchestra. That would have been fun to hear. And in these solo radio performances, Clarke tended to select crowd-pleasing salon-type pieces, short works. Here she plays also her own arrangement of All Through the Night, which we don't seem to have anymore. She didn't choose her own compositions or the works of modern British performers, or sorry, composers for these particular programs. Excuse me. Which to me shows that by choosing to play really accessible and popular works, she saw these solo opportunities to bill herself as a great performer and violist, as well as expose the public to the beauties of the viola through works that were a little more traditional. So these aspects of her career were all pieces of the same whole musician that she was, rather than side jobs, secondary to her compositional aspirations. And just as a side note, some of these pieces that she played on her program are not as well known today and might be wonderful encore pieces or additions to recitals if you need to fill out a recital program. So then here's the last one in 1929, October 15th. Lastly, I wanted to include just a quick note about the one concerto that we find in her sheet music. It's very likely that she performed the Handel Casadesus concerto because it's full of fingerings and bowings, and she took the time to write her own cadenza and tape it into her part here. So this piece wasn't even published until 1924. So she really would have been a seasoned performer by the time she was performing this, and also a seasoned composer by the time she was writing this cadenza. And it is a very fun cadenza, although quite short, but very lovely. And it showcases the beautiful tone quality of the viola in a beautiful way. So today I've shared just a few examples of Clarke's contributions to viola performance. I'm sure there are many performances that she gave that were never written down or recorded in any way, as well as old newspapers that contain her name that have yet to be mined for this information. One of the questions I get asked most frequently, as when I told my fellow violists what I'm researching for my dissertation, is why did she stop? And whether we're talking about a performing or composing here, I think the current literature may misrepresent her somewhat in this way. Because as I've looked through these old primary sources, one of my chief thoughts has been, wow, this woman never stopped. Her varied, busy, and distinguished career spanned around 35 years, depending on how you count it. After 1939, when she came to the US and got stuck here because of the war, her performing career did slow down considerably because she didn't have her old connections to the BBC or her former chamber groups to continue on with. And it had been quite some time since she had toured the US at that point. She did persevere though, and was able to continue composing her last few pieces. And she also did perform in various capacities. By the time the war was over, and I think people don't realize this, she was already 59 years old and struggling with arthritis that made viola playing much more difficult. Life expectancy in the US in 1945 was only 68. So she was probably really considered quite old at that point, at that time. And remember that Tertis retired from viola playing at the age of 61. And William Primrose's hearing problem was first recognized when he was in his early 40s, which considerably slowed down his performing career in his 50s and 60s as he increasingly focused on teaching rather than performing as a resident professor in Tokyo, Sydney, and finally Utah. And Hindemith only lived to the age of 68. We so frequently revere Primrose, Tertis, and Hindemith as pioneers of our long neglected instrument. While Rebecca Clarke did not perform as many viola concertos with orchestras as her male contemporaries, her work promoting the viola as a first-class performer should be recognized right alongside them, and she ought to be counted as among the great violists of the early 20th century. Thank you so much.